and welcome to a whirlwind tour of resources. And my name is Virginia Lorenzi. Nice to meet you. Our learning objectives for this session is to review and reflect on the resources defined in FHIR to help inform solution design. We will consider purpose and application of key resources, how to read a resource, relationships between resources, little nuances such as maturity, flags, terminology, cardinality, and patterns, and the necessity of profiles. So I've divided up this tour into three parts: the foundational resources, administrative, and clinical. Those are arbitrary groupings based on FHIR's arbitrary groupings loosely. So let's start with foundational resources. So the most foundational resource of all is the resource that is called resource. This resource is upon which all other resources in FHIR are built. All resources inherit attributes from the resource. So you'll see below the structure view of the resource, and it consists of 4 elements: ID, meta, implicit rules, and language. And then I want to point out that meta actually has a complex data type, capital META, which adds another 6 components: version ID last updated, source, profile, security labels, because you can actually label each resource based on the security you need to put on that resource, and tags. And you will notice there's cardinality listed in the middle where it says 0 to 1. All of these fields are optional, but they are all going to be inherited by every resource within FHIR. Moving on, we have the domain resource. Domain resource is built on top of resource, which means it's inheriting the attributes from resource, and it adds an additional foundational attributes such as text, which allows us to have a narrative for every resource, and the ability to do extensions, which is a way that we can extend FHIR for different implementations. Most resources are built on the domain resource type, which means they inherit the fields from domain resource, which inherits the fields from resource. Moving on are resources that help us with content structure. There's a list. That's a flat, possibly ordered list of resources. A great example would be your active med list. There's the questionnaire resource, which represents a list of questions and possible answers that you would author and put in a certain order, and you can send that as a FHIR resource. There are many uses for that within healthcare. For example, we send surveys to our patients, like screening surveys, such as the PHQ-9 depression screening survey. And then what's important is getting a response back. And that's where you actually get answers back to this survey or questionnaire. We have 3 resources that help us with documents. The composition resources for a document that is composed completely of FHIR resources, and you specify that structure. And then in addition to the composition resource, there's the document, I'm getting a sound. There's the document reference resource, which is a resource that has metadata about documents, but doesn't actually contain the document in the FHIR format. It could be maybe in a PDF format or something. And then there's document manifest, which is just a collection of documents. And now, considering with our foundational resources on the tour, we have security resources. There's a lot about security in FHIR, and there's a lot about security that is not covered in FHIR. Security, we have that label I showed you nestled into the resource. There's also different documentation within the FHIR spec that indicates how ideas on how to keep your application safe, and other surrounding specs that help us with authentication and authorization, like Smart on FHIR. But there are 4 resources that are actually in FHIR today. I am looking at our the latest build that you can access on the FHIR site, which is the preview 2 of R5. There's the consent resource, which is that record of a healthcare consumer's choices. You might think of a consent to share data, and that's a really important consent for interoperability. But there are other really important consents in healthcare, such as the consent for treatment or the consent not to be treated, like please do not resuscitate me. There's also the new permission resource, which has a similarity consent, but it's really authority by which data is shared. So the data is being shared, but why am I allowed to do it? I'm allowed to do it because of maybe the HIPAA law, or I'm allowed to do it because of the GDPR law, something like that. We have audit event, which helps us keep a record of events for purposes of things like operation and privacy, security. And provenance, which is similar to audit event, a little bit overlapping, but has a different perspective. And this is the lineage of a resource. Where did this resource come from? It describes the entities and processes involved in producing and delivering or otherwise influencing the resource. If you look to the right, I have a narrative, kind of an example of what would be contained in a provenance resource. Moving on, we have exchange-related resources. If any of you have had any experience with using basic FHIR APIs, you've probably experienced the bundle resource. Bundle is just a grouping of resources. And a very common example is the response from a FHIR search API call. Subscription is a resource that supports this great feature that if a FHIR server may provide for you. A FHIR server may allow you to subscribe to get notified on certain events. For example, let's say you are a primary care physician, a GP, and hospital's FHIR server offers a subscription service to admit notifications. Well, then you could say, for my patients, I would like to subscribe to this hospital's admit notifications feed, and then they would send the notification. The subscription is just the resource that is used to communicate that subscription request. Message header is used for messaging, and with FHIR, we can do messaging, just like we could with HL7 version 2 or with version 3. So this is when a real-world event happens and FHIR resources are assembled together and sent as a message to a downstream system. The message header is metadata for that message. And now, still in foundational, we have operations. Operations are a really important part of our RESTful API in FHIR. And we think of our typical operations like create, read, update, delete. But sometimes there are operations that are a bit fancier that are kind of built on these. Some are built into the FHIR specification, such as the metadata operation, which I love. That's when you can ask a FHIR server, what does it support? What are its capabilities? And that you can get with the metadata operation. Or the transaction operation, which allows you to say that either this series of API calls are going to work, or if any of them fail, roll it all back, which is typical definition of transaction. But what if you and your implementation community want to create a new operation? Well, you can do that in your implementation guide using these resources for operations, like operation definition, parameters, and operation response. Kind of speaking about implementation guides, let's move on to conformance resources. Conformance is a really important part of FHIR because it's really important to constrain the core FHIR spec for specific implementations. And we have numerous resources that help support that. There's the capability statement, which tells you the capabilities of a FHIR server. And the rest of these definitions really are the building blocks of implementation guides. But maybe to hurt your brain a little bit, the FHIR spec itself is built off these structures. So every FHIR resource uses the structure definition. Every FHIR data type uses the element definition. What you want to know more about profiling, which I really encourage that you learn more, there's a session tomorrow. Also, foundational to FHIR is terminology. It's not enough to just have our data model. Sometimes we need more information about the data, and terminology helps us get to that really detailed semantic interoperability that we need. I don't just want to know it's a lab result. I want to know what kind of lab result. That's why it's really important that we have data types that use terminology for that additional specificity. So there are data types related to that: code, coding, and codable concept. And there are also specific FHIR resources, such as concept map and terminology capabilities, naming system, code system, and value set. And all of these actually help you interact with a terminology server. Now, this is when all of you guys are probably going to log out of my session and run off to another session, because there is a terminology server session going on at the same time. But because everything is going to be recorded, you'll have a chance to go over there later. So now let's move into administration. And a really important part of any interoperability we do in healthcare is the people in healthcare, people and entities. So we can think of patients, and patients can be linked to other patients. The patient is our subject of care. And then the linkage is when some reason why two patients we link together, like a mother who just had a baby is linked to the newborn. And then we also care about people that are related to the care of a patient, such as related person and practitioner. Related person is someone who's involved in the patient care, but they're not directly responsible. Examples include a family member, neighbor, maybe the neighbor brought the person to the hospital, attorney, guide dog. Now the practitioner is the clinician. This is someone who's legally responsible for a patient's care. There's also a person resource. But of interest, the person resource is not that commonly used. A person represents someone irrespective of care, and the other resources do not inherit fields from person. Each one of these resources has the demographics elements in it to uniquely identify the patient, related person, practitioner, or person. And finally, not covered by any of these resources is contact person. Sometimes, when you get care in the healthcare system, they ask you to name someone who they can contact in an emergency. Now that person might be the person who's involved in your care, but maybe not. If it's to represent just the contact part of it, it is just represented as a set of elements within the patient resource. And so we'll look at that. Here is our patient resource. This is called the structure view. Again, we saw that before, which is a linear list of the fields in a FHIR resource. And you'll see at the bottom, there is a folder that is opened up and has subfields. So those subfields can be abstracted into a concept called contact. And there's actually more fields than are shown here. And you could close them up so you just see the high level elements if you wanted to. But really, when you have FHIR going over the wire, you would be kind of opening up all the folders, and this would be your linear list of fields that you would send. Let's look a little bit more into this resource, because I want to make sure that you really understand how to read resources. So looking at that contact, you will notice, again, that it's a folder, which means it has contained fields. It's not a separate resource, anything, it just contained fields. Then you'll also notice that there is a cube sometimes. And the cube means that that particular field has a complex data type. And a complex data type is just sort of code for nestled in the data type are more than one field. It explodes into multiple fields. And then if you see a rectangle with 3 dots on the left, that is a primitive data type. Those do not explode. And you see examples here like Boolean and integer. Those are very basic data types. And then you see the question mark. The question mark also opens up into multiple fields, but it has a different purpose. In that case, it's going to be a choice of one of these fields. for example, either you had a multiple birth or you didn't. And, you know, that's one choice. And the other choice is, how many babies did you birth? Maybe you had 3. You'll also see over here flags. And flags are, and the flags start with this summary flag. And the summary flag means exactly that. Every field in here that has the summary indicator means that if you do a summary search in FHIR for this resource, you will get just those attributes. So you can imagine that the designer of this resource picked the fields they thought would be most useful to summarize the intent of the resource. And then there's the modifier flag. That's pretty interesting. That's the question mark with the exclamation point. That says that this particular flag indicates that the field modifies the meaning of the entire resource. And that means it's unsafe to ignore it. Let's look at the examples here. We have the active field and the deceased field. Now, if the modifier flag says the patient's not active, well, certainly there's things I wouldn't want to do with it, like the way I would want to treat active patient resources, and even worse, deceased. You know, if I'm putting together a list of patients to contact and ask them to get immunized, I do not want to be sending that to the home of someone who's deceased. And then there's I, and that is the invariant flag. You'll see that by contact there. And what the invariant flag is telling us is there are special rules that apply. And you'll see there's a rule. It says, shall at least contain a contact something or other. I don't know, I covered it up. And then cardinality, we mentioned this before. 0 to 1, 0 to 3, 0 to many, those all mean a field is optional. 1 to 1, 1 to many, that means the field is required. 1 to 1 means max 1, 1 to star, max any. I want you to notice that throughout the whole FHIR spec, we are not seeing examples of 1 to something. That is why it is so important that you don't implement the naked FHIR standard, but instead you use profiles built on top of it. You use implementation guides, because that's where we're going to constrain that. Just imagine a FHIR interface where we sent a patient resource that was completely empty. That is useless. So moving on, let's look at a little more resource clues under patient. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I miss things that are like at the top of the screen or on the side. And that's what I did for a long time when I read resources. At the top, when you first open up a resource, you will see this line of content, examples, detailed descriptions, mappings, profiles and extensions, operations, and R3 conversions. I just want to point that out because you might miss it. And one of my favorite things in there is examples, because examples will really help you understand the resource. You might think this resource is too theoretical. I don't quite get it. But when you read like 15 examples of how this resource is really used in a clinical setting, then you're like, oh, I get it now. And it can also help you when you're communicating with your clinicians and your users, so you can find that common ground and know what to implement for them. Plus, it's a great way to do searches. If you go into the search function in the FHIR spec, you can search for what kind of data you're really trying to represent, like temperature or blood pressure. And then there's some other really important hints here. Like you have a resource and you don't quite get it, and you want to talk to someone who really gets it. Well, one way is to talk to the work group that created it. And maybe you actually have problems with it and you want to recommend enhancements or fixes. It would be the patient administration work group. Or maybe you're so excited by this resource or set of resources that you want to really help maybe develop new resources. This is the work group to go to. Another really important aspect of resources is both the maturity level and the normative flag. When a resource is first born, it's like a baby. It's very immature. It is very low quality. It is very incomplete. It is has no experience with the world, right? It's also easy to change. Then it goes up the maturity ladder from 0 to 5, and then trial, use, and normative. And as it goes up that ladder, it gets reviewed and validated, and it gets tested in connectathons, and then it gets tested in the real world. And it becomes more and more mature, more and more complete. And as that happens, it also is much harder to change. So what this means for you is the best resources to implement in a large scale setting would be resources that are very mature. It also means that the resources you can really have an impact on are going to be those resources that are earlier on in the process. The reason why this is so important and normative especially, that we don't change them when they're really baked. We can still change them when they're wrong and when they need to be enhanced, but we have a very careful process, is because we don't want to break existing implementations. And we have a whole process for doing that. And there's a couple of other flags like security category, which is a hint to the level of confidentiality you're going to want to have with this resource. This is pretty secure because it's patient level versus a general, business level. Moving on, let's look at the healthcare environment. We have numerous resources in the healthcare environment, such as practitioner or practitioner role, which is the role a clinician plays in context, the healthcare service, the organization, and then the physical location, which could range from a building to a freezer we keep specimens in, and a technical endpoint. We always think about, like, give me the URL for that FHIR server, right? That's the idea of the technical endpoint. There are groupings. We have the group resource and the care team resource. Group resource is a group of entities related to some sort of healthcare problem, such as a group of men in a research cohort, a group of patients in group counseling, or a group of birds that are sick and we need to watch them from a public health perspective. But that kind of grouping is very different than the care team resource, which is a group of physicians that are working together, all with respect to one patient. Continuing on to our administration, we have encounter-related resources. Encounter is that concept of when you interface with the healthcare system. Every intersection you could call an encounter, although you could define that at wider levels or more granular levels, and that's sort of up to you, and ideally up to your implementation guide writers. An episode of care will span multiple encounters, and it's when we want to manage an entire episode, maybe across different encounters. An account is for the billing of this care. This is the encounter resource in the UML view. The UML view has a different take on how to show things. It puts the abstracted resource with all those folders closed right in the middle. That's where we see encounter. And all the classes we see surrounding encounter, those are all those folders opened up, like we saw contact before. So everything on this screen right now in the UML view, these are all part of the same encounter resource. I also want to point out that resources refer to resources. This is really important. So you'll see here that there's a patient who's the subject of the encounter, or a whole group that's the subject of encounter. An encounter takes place as part of 0 or more episodes of care. There may be an order, a service request is an order for this encounter. Maybe it was a referral to a specialist, and it's a specialist encounter. And you'll see a whole bunch of referrals in here. You'll also notice that it's possible for encounter to be part of another encounter. So this is where you could divide up encounters and have kind of sub encounters underneath them if you wanted to. Around the edges, you'll see there's 0 to many class history, 0 to many participation, 0 to many location. I just wanted to point out that the reason for that is sometimes in an encounter, the way you might represent it is you might show both, you might keep a single encounter, but the patient spent time in the emergency class and then the inpatient class. Or you have a single encounter and the patient has clinicians that participate or related persons participate. But maybe, you just have a set for the whole time, but you might have sets for different periods of time, and the same for location. I know during the pandemic, keeping track, it was really especially important to know who was where, at what location, during what times, to know what we had available at any point in time, and also to track potential spread of infection. Episode of care usually has a care manager who is responsible for watching an entire episode of care and working with a care team across the community. And an episode of care may have multiple encounters, but you will notice that there is no encounter in episode of care. This is an important nuance to realize. Resources are connected to resources, but sometimes it's in one direction, the logical direction, because an episode of care could have many, many encounters. So the encounters instead point to the episode of care. And there are also financial resources that help with payment for healthcare. And I'm going to recommend you consider other DevDays classes we have on DaVinci or Karen to get a better understanding of these and how they're being used in implementation guides that are going on right now. And finally, let's talk about scheduling resources. You know, you'd like to go for, or you've been recommended by your doctor that you need to get an MRI, okay? And then you call up, or maybe it's an online, ideally not calling up because you're using FHIR, online scheduling system will access the schedule, or maybe more than one schedule. And a schedule just consists of, you know, truly a schedule with days and times and busy and free slots. And then the appointment is your request for one of those slots. An appointment response is the response from that request, either positive or negative, and details about your appointment. I wanted to point out, if you open up appointment response, you will see that there is one of those folders that opens up, and it allows one-to-many participants in this appointment. And that makes sense because you would want at least one participant, right? But it might be that you have quite a few. I know that if I need an MRI, they'd need me, the patient, they'd need the doctor who could read the MRI technician, they would also need the MRI machine and the MRI room. Now let's go on to clinical care. I'm telling you, whirlwind tour. You with me still, I hope? Okay. Now imagine you show up for your visit, okay? First thing when you show up for a visit, you're probably gonna be asked a bunch of questions. Maybe you're filling out some sort of electronic form. Maybe you're being interviewed by a nurse or some medical assistant. They're gonna wanna know, what problems do you have? What's your family's medical history? Do you have any allergies? What medications are you taking? These are all covered in resources: condition, family medical history, allergy intolerance, and medication usage. They might run some diagnostics, you know, ones you can run in the office, like vital signs. Some labs, you know, easy labs like the urine dipstick test, or like a nasal swab. We have a lot of that going on in New York lately. Maybe an X-ray or an EKG. And the results of those diagnostics are going to be represented in FHIR resources such as observation and diagnostic report, and sometimes imaging study. And then the clinician is going to want to evaluate and diagnose. And they're probably going to rule out some conditions and add conditions in, and maybe have a clinical impression. Then they're going to want to decide how to treat. Deciding how to treat is developing a care plan. So making a plan. I'm going to talk a little bit more about care plan in a minute. And then they're going to order things. They're going to order maybe a referral, or order a procedure, medication equipment, follow-up diagnostics. And there are numerous resources in FHIR that represent these orders, which I am showing here on the right. I'm going to talk about more in a minute. And then they might actually do some treatment while you're in the office, like maybe they'll actually administer a medication, do a procedure, or give you an immunization. So let's go back to talk about care plan a little bit. So a care plan is, you have a care team, and often there is a care manager, right, who's kind of watching this care team. And this care team and the care plan, consists of different parts. It consists of the conditions that are being treated, the goals that you have to accomplish in this care plan, and activities that will help you complete those goals. Maybe it's a referral to some specialists, maybe it's a special diet, maybe it's making sure someone's calling you up to see if you're taking your medications. Maybe they're going to write an order for you to get a home glucose monitor. And I kind of show how those resources are related using this tool called clinfire.com. I'm using Graph Builder. It's a nice tool to kind of get a graphical idea of FHIR instances. It's a free tool. I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit about orders. And the kinds of orders in FHIR that are defined right now are service requests, which covers majority of the requests, nutrition order, medication request, vision prescription, device request. That's also something called supply request. But these are the primary clinical ones right here. And then from these requests, there could be corresponding events that kind of mirror them. Like, you have a request for procedure to be done, and then you have the procedure being done. You have a request for a diagnostic study, and then you have the diagnostic study being done. You have the request for a patient to have a medication, and then you have the supply of that medication and or the administration of that medication. All of these orders kind of look similar, and all of these resulting events kind of look similar as well. They look similar to each other, and the categories look similar. And what we decided in our modeling of FHIR is they're similar enough that we see the same kind of pattern. So we have a concept called patterns in FHIR, and these follow the workflow pattern. And orders are a subset of requests, which is part of the workflow pattern, and these resulting events are a subset of events. So you will see that some FHIR resources are standardized to have the same or similar attributes because they are similar in nature. They're a mechanism to enhance consistency across the standard. They're not resources. They're not programmable. It's not like a case of inheriting fields. And not all resources that are in a pattern will strictly adhere to the pattern. Some somewhat fit, but not all the way, if that makes any sense. And the thing is while all that's true, understanding patterns will help you master the specification because it reduces the complexity. There is a description of the different kinds of patterns that are out there at this link. And once you have an idea of what patterns are out there, you will start seeing, oh, this looks just like the other thing I saw. So kind of going back to our tour, let's look at observation. It is one of my favorite things in HL7. We've been doing observations since the beginning of time in HL7. It represents really just an observation of something. It's a fundamental resource in clinical care. You can use it to represent all sorts of observations, like a vital sign or set of vital signs, laboratory data, imaging results, device measurements, personal characteristics like I'm pregnant. I really hope I'm not. I'm pregnant, I've got blue eyes, or any other kind of characteristic. And you will see that observation, again, relates to other resources. The most important field in observation is this field called value, because the most important thing is what is observed. And you'll notice it has a whole bunch of different data types that it could have. If you have a diagnostic report, like in a laboratory test or a radiology test or pathology test, you're going to need kind of a wrapper around those observations, and we call that diagnostic report. So in the example on the right, you will see the things in white at the top and the bottom. That represents that wrapper. And then the gray lines in between, those are the different observations. And so now we are at our exciting end of the tour. I'm sorry I couldn't take you into every room, but I do want to encourage you to go on and do a self-tour after this class. And I kind of want to conclude with help you find what you're interested in. You can, of course, find that complete list of resources on the resource list on the FHIR spec. And then remember, as you're looking at a resource, to look for the work group, the maturity, whether it's normative enough, and examples. And that brings up the concept of searching the FHIR spec. There's a search button on every page of the FHIR spec. Just basically search the spec to find what you need. You never have to do things alone when you're part of the HL7 community. It's one of the most amazing things about working with HL7 standards. So we have chat.phir.org. ask the dumbest question you want, ask the smartest question you want. In fact, I have to tell you that that's how I really got my start in the HL7 community, is from asking stupid questions. Please join the conversation. You will end up enhancing the standard when you do, and you'll learn so much more about it because there's so many nuances that are represented on that chat. And then finally, there's this resource guide that also might be handy. So I really felt like I did a whirlwind. Diego, I want to know if there's any questions out there.
We had only one question about if we should use observation if a device sends us information. I answer yes, you have to use observation if a device sends you information.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The only question we had. Yeah.
You know, observation can be used for like anything, really. You know, you might also want to be using some of the device-related resources, but the actual data that device is sending, you know, like the clinical data would go on observation.
Yeah, you will use device to identify which device sent you the observation with the proper information and attributes for the device, like the vendor, manufacturer, the version, and that kind of stuff. But for the actual information on the observation, you will use observation.
Right, that's correct. So really enjoy the rest of your tour. If you didn't see the room that has research resources, or the one on clinical decision support resources, medication definition resources, there's lots of other interesting resources out there, but I think these are the fundamental resources that really you're going to see in much of what you do with FHIR. So if there are no more questions, then I guess we are done with this session. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Virginia.
Thank you.
I will stop recording.